More truth about the low back and how it works. What we're going to do in this tutorial is talk about the lower back, specific muscles of the lower back. We're going to talk about how they work. We're going to talk about the best exercises for them. And then what we'll be able to do off the back of that, we'll be able to talk about how we train them the best, because there are a lot of myths out there, a lot of influence out there giving, let's just say, false information for now. I'm going to add a bit more context to that. But essentially false information about how the low back works and then how we go about training it, which could potentially cause people more problems rather than solve the problems that they're trying to solve. So without further ado, let's get into it. In part one, we're going to talk about two muscles in particular. So we're going to talk about deep lying muscles of the spine. I will link in more about the lower back and other muscles of the lower back, but the main focus of this episode is all about the deep lying muscles of the lower spine, because it's that is getting taken out of context. The low back and how it works has been taken out of context as a general rule, but these two muscles in particular, which is multifidus and interspinalis. So these are deep lying muscles of the spine. They are sort of intricate muscles of the spine that people are saying are movement muscles, and we need to train them using flexion and extension in a back extension, for example. Now, that's what I want to say is false. That's not how you train those muscles. So first of all, to try and answer the question of how do we train those muscles, first of all, we're going to look at what are these muscles and where are they. So if we take multifidus to start with, multifidus goes all the way up the spine. So from the base of the spine to the base of the to the top of the spine, the base of the skull. Now, there's an assumption that it's one whole muscle. That's the sort of the first incorrect part. But it's a group. Let's just call it a group of muscles. Now, multifidus goes from vertebra to vertebra. So it's a small muscle that goes from L5 to L4, and then L4 to L3, and then L3 to L2, L2 to L1, and that continues all the way up the spine. So it runs from vertebra to vertebra. Now, if we take interspinalis, that goes from what's known as process to process. So where you've got the vertebral body, so if you're looking down on the vertebra, you've got that big round barrel looking part of the vertebra. That's known obviously as the vertebral body. Then you've got the sort of the three sort of spiky bits that come off the back. They're known as processes. You've got transverse process, and then you've got the main process at the back. Interspinalis goes between the processes, and then you've got rotaries which go in a diagonal direction. Now, what do these muscles do? Well, what I'm going to talk about are their primary roles first. So the first primary role is postural adjustment. So these are not gross movements. These are very fine movements. Because that leads on to point number 2, which is proprioceptive feedback. And proprioceptive feedback is just sending information to the central nervous system. So the spine, the spinal cord and the brain. So what the body is doing is it's reading where the spine is, and it's these muscles that are telling it where to go. And these very fine postural adjustments. Now, when I say fine movements, I'm not talking about sort of slouched and into extended. What I'm talking about is very fine vertebral adjustments of the spine and the stability between vertebra. So the next one is counteracting flexion forces is another one. So that is if the spine gets too flexed, it starts to go into contraction. So there's a degree of counteracting flexion there. And then the fourth one, which is the least of these roles, is extension movements. Now, why extension movements? The main muscles for extension will be longissimus and iliocostalis. Now, that's not their prime role either, but they do more extension than multifidus and interspinalis. And these muscles aren't even, that's not their primary role. So if the primary role isn't in longissimus and iliocostalis, it's certainly not going to be in these much more finer, smaller muscles with finer movement. So we have to start looking at what these muscles do in a little bit more specific detail. So what we're going to do in part 2, we'll start to look at how we go about training these muscles, because we know they aren't movement muscles. So we're going to add more onto that, and we're going to start talking about how we go about training them. So what's the best exercise for these muscles, which will then help us understand how we then go about training them? Well, before I go into that, I just want to mention I'm leaving sources down in the description below, which will, again, provide further information on top of what I'm saying. Again, if you have any questions about any of that, again, stick them in the comments below. If you're enjoying the information so far, hit the like button, and also hit the subscribe button and the bell icon as well. So how do we best what's the best exercise for these muscles? Well, that basically lies in understanding the function, which we've kind of already talked about so far. So let's delve a little bit more into the anatomy of these muscles. So we've talked about where they are. They're close to the spine and they're very small muscles. So with regards to that, they don't have a lot of force and they don't have a large range of movement. So because they don't have a lot of force, they aren't able to sort of perform heavy movements, if you will, or lift heavy weights, if that makes sense. Because they don't have a great range of movement, they aren't able to do gross movement. Another part of their anatomy is muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles detect length of muscles, or length changes in muscles, I should say, because they'll detect when muscle gets longer, and they'll detect when muscles get shorter. Now, if you can imagine, muscles are made up of many, many thousands of what are known as muscle fibers, and they're just like long cords, if you will. And then you've got muscle spindles that wrap around them, literally like a spring. So if you take a spring and you can sort of make it longer, and then it goes back to the way it came. And if you turn and look down the end, what you'll see is basically a hole that runs all the way through and down. That's where the muscle fiber sits. And the muscle spindle basically sits around it like a coiled spring. And then as the muscle gets longer, these coils separate. So it detects the length, the distance between them. When it shortens, obviously the coils get closer together and it detects that. So it will detect rotation, it will detect flexion, it will detect extension, it will detect flexion and rotation, it will detect extension and rotation in either and all directions. So we've got these high density muscle spindles, or high density of muscle spindles. So that starts to tell us it's more about spinal stability and it's more about spinal coordination, because it's trying to read where the vertebrae are and where the processes are and what they're doing. Are they close together? So if one gets closer together, the other should be getting far away, and vice versa. As we go into like a lateral flexion, when we go into a rotation, they should pick up where the vertebrae are going. So the primary function is providing feedback to the central nervous system, not movement. Movement is a secondary and a tertiary sort of function of them. Primarily, they are there to detect changes in length and the position of the spine. So that's kind of the first thing that we need to understand, because if they aren't movement muscles, we don't train them with a back extension. It's not a useful exercise to train better stability. The second thing is they have minimal contribution to spinal extension. So again, when we talk about back extension, we go either, if we're led on the floor, we go from what is essentially a neutral spine into an extended spine. So they don't play a great role within that. That will be down to longissimus and iliocostalis. And again, that's not even their primary role, but they have the ability to do it. The third one is they are basically performing fine-tuned postural control to help maintain segmental stability. So if they notice two vertebrae are rotating too much, they will have a bit of fine control there, and they will do that resisted flexion because they're noticing they're going a bit too far. So it will start to hold the spine to bring stability to that segment, to those two vertebrae. So by training it with back extensions, you're not training their function. In some respects, you're sort of counteracting their function, if that makes sense. Because what you want to be able to do is, with regards to postural control, so I guess number one, what you want the torso to be able to do is maintain posture. So that's sort of number one, maintain posture. Number two is resist movement. So by resisting movement is we choose exercises that have inbuilt instability within them. And we maintain posture throughout that. Because that's doing the fine-tuned postural control. That's using the high density of muscle spindles. And we aren't really going through large ranges of movement, which, again, aren't that useful to them. And it certainly doesn't work a lot through that sort of contraction phase, or they're not contributing through their contraction phase. They will lengthen and contract, but again, as I mentioned, that is not their primary function. So trying to train the primary function of flexion into extension is not training those muscles. So if you are being told you need to do, let's just say, a back extension to get the deeper sort of muscles of the spine, that is essentially incorrect. That's not what you're doing. And that's what the four studies will sort of talk you through in the description below. So the first one by Bogduk discusses the high density of muscle spindles in the deep spinal muscles and their role in proprioception and segmental control. Then the next one by McGill explains the function of the intrinsic spinal muscles, including interspinalis, in maintaining posture and providing proprioceptive feedback. Kendall describes the interspinalis as having a greater role in stability and proprioception rather than force production. And then Schlipp discusses how small spinal muscles rich in sensory receptors are key for spinal control rather than primary movement. So it's very important that we understand this type of information, because until a coach, trainer, therapist understand this, they won't understand the type of exercise to be providing you with. So what we want to be able to do is use exercises that are stability based, that have instability inherently within the exercise. So in very broad terms and very crude terms, balance type exercises. Now, that's not the most ideal, but it will give you an idea. It's something that will try and offset your posture. That's the type of exercise. Now, these are a little bit harder to describe because they aren't the mainstream. They aren't bicep curls. They aren't bench press. They aren't back extension. They aren't sit-ups. It's not those types of exercises. And what we'll try and do in the next part is we'll try and talk more about those exercises, but it's going to be a little bit harder to do because the description of them you may not recognise in a format like this. If I was in a gym, it may be a little bit easier, but that will be for another tutorial. This is trying to give you the underlying information, and what I'll do in a further tutorial is actually show you exercises. But for now, let's go into part number 3, which is talking about how we go about training them. How do we go about training multifidus and interspinalis and the deeper muscles of the spine? Now, should we train these muscles like a bicep, like a quad, where we use length change to train the muscle? So biceps are more force production muscles, so they would be known as a prime mover. So when you look at an exercise, a bicep curl, your elbow flexes, that contracts the bicep and the wrist moves closer to the shoulder. If we take the quads and we go to straighten the leg, the quads contract and the leg straightens. That's because the quad is a prime mover. It is a much bigger muscle. It's a force producer and it's a movement muscle. We can say the same about the glutes. We can say the same about the triceps, the latissimus dorsi, the pecs as well. So a traditional idea of training won't fit for the spine and it won't fit for the core. But it does fit for the limbs. So pushing exercises, pulling exercises. Now, where it can be useful is if we are performing, let's say a single arm cable press. So I'm stood up, I'm pushing the cable forward. Now, if obviously my pec, my shoulder and my tricep are pushing the handle forward. For my torso, for me to be able to train those muscles more effectively, what I want to be able to do is maintain posture and resist being pulled around by the exercise. So as I mentioned, biceps, they're prime movers, mostly type 2 fibers, voluntary large movements, best training method, strength and hypertrophy training. When we move into multifidus, spinal stability posture, mostly type 1 fibers, so they work from a more endurance perspective over a prolonged period of time. They're involuntary and have low level endurance, as I mentioned. So then we've got stabilization exercises, that's the best method, and activation exercises. So I've already mentioned one. We've got that single arm cable press. So if you want to integrate training these deep lying muscles with, let's just say, conventional training, you would perform an exercise like a single arm cable press and resist the weight pulling you around. So you would maintain posture. Now, if we look at a simple core exercise, we would use the bird dogs, where you're on all fours, you lift an arm and a leg. So when you go into extending the leg and the opposite arm, you want to keep your shoulders and hips level. If they're wobbling around everywhere, you haven't got stability of the spine because they're wobbling around everywhere. When you take the arm and the leg out and you're able to hold posture, that's those muscles working properly. So it's understanding that the idea of, and I call it sort of a bodybuilding philosophy, which is strengthening a muscle. So if we go down the road of trying to strengthen multifidus and strengthen interspinalis, that is the wrong foundation to start with. So all the exercises that are trying to do it are essentially incorrect. Now, it's key to understand it. Just because they can do it doesn't mean it's their primary function. Because we understand a little bit more about the anatomy now and the density of these length change receptors called the muscle spindles, it starts to highlight to us that that's their secondary function, and their primary function is this postural control that I'm talking about. If you want to challenge your posture a little bit more, go into a plank and lift your arm off the floor. If your hips or body either rotate or weight shift, again, you don't have stability in the right area. If you can go into a plank lift the arm up on your back and you stay completely still, there is a stability going through the spine and the hips. If we take another one, if you go down onto one knee and you place the knee and the foot directly in front of the knee, you are basically on a tightrope on one knee. Again, if you're very stable in that position, you have good postural control. If you then add a weight and sort of lift it from side to side, again, you can maintain proper posture. That's training those muscles. There are many exercises out there. If we take kettlebells, for example, a little bit more sort of gross stability. So we're starting to integrate the whole of the core now. But essentially, kettlebells are best for resisting movement. So again, with sit-ups, we are trying to create movement. With back extensions, we are trying to create movement. These muscles don't work like that. Kettlebells are more effective. With all the exercises we've talked about resisting movement. We don't want our body to wobble around. If you choose an exercise where you can maintain posture, and then your arms and legs can move around that, that's the best type of training for these types of muscles. So I'm kind of starting to go round in circles a little bit, but how we train these muscles is by resisting movement of the torso. Your legs and arms can move, so it doesn't mean you're a robot. What it does mean is that your legs, which have the power generating muscles, and I've said this in countless podcast episodes and tutorials, your glutes are big, powerful movers. That's what they do. Use them for that. Your core muscles are there to act like carbon fibre and transfer energy between the arms and the legs, from legs to arms and arms to legs. That's what they're designed to do. They're there to design to resist movement. Sports performance. You get all your power from your limbs, and the core transfers it. If you got movement in the core, you're leaking energy. It's known as an energy leak. Now, if we take a golf swing as an example, because this is where people then go, yeah, but what about a golf swing? They've got to move their spine. With a golf swing, when you look at it, when you get to the top of the movement and you start, there is a contraction. So there is a moment of force generation. If there is laxity through the spine, that's when you get the energy leak. So it's that initial rotation, because what then happens is when the club comes through the air, muscles, they don't relax, but their activation dampens. When they hit the ball, they get a little mini contraction again. So we have to understand these nuances with regards to movement. So again, if we go back and let's sort of, I guess, conclude. These muscles are stability, postural muscles. They are there for spinal stability. They are there to help resist movement, and they are there to help you maintain posture. They don't have high force, so they have low force. They are best used to resist movement when it comes to the plank, the bird dog, or even a golf swing, because they're actually resisting too much movement between vertebra and vertebra. So it's not really in our conscious control. When we talk about rehabilitation, it's the same thing. The main focus shouldn't be contraction, relaxation, or shorten, lengthen. That shouldn't be the main focus. What should be the main focus is resisting movement within the torso. Then you're training these muscles. Because as I've mentioned, there are people out there that will tell you, we need to do a back extension to really target these small, deep muscles, and we need to go into full flexion to target these muscles. That is not the case. they have that as a role, but that is not their primary role. If you really want to get the most out of these muscles, and I cannot say it, I guess, any more clearer than this, do exercises where you have to resist moving the spine. You will get much more from it with regards to stabilizing the spine. And that goes for rehabilitation, everyday life, fitness, the whole lot. So if you've got any questions, leave them below. If you've liked the content, hit the like button. If you want to watch more, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. Many thanks for watching. I'll speak to you soon.